Today, what Rajiv would have to present before us, the provocative title that you have, I think requires a self-conscious attempt on the part of the listeners to listen and empty their minds before what he has to say. Because one of the things about communication is that most of the time we don't listen. We repeat what we have got inside. And resultantly, when even distinguished members ask questions, these arise from either their experience or the fund of the information data bank inside here. So the clicking is only there. And having made this one basic provocative statement, I will now invite Sri Rajiv Malhotra to present what he has to say, provocative or healing.
Yesterday, I made some assertions to provoke people to start thinking in a certain way. One of them, and I just sort of list some of the major ones, one of them that contrary to what postmodernist fashionable theories are claiming, the dominant powers in the world are not going away, their grand narratives are not becoming lighter, nation states are not dissolving, boundaries are not disappearing. This is true for the corporate sector, for the countries as nation states, it's true for religious, organized religion, and so forth. So I have a serious problem with those who think that since postmodernism is now kind of a ground reality, India should self-destruct, self-dissolve, self-deconstruct because everybody else is doing it. I don't see anybody else doing it. That was an important point. Secondly, unlike while we understand American pop culture, that is not symptomatic of the deeper culture. The deeper culture consists of a combination of institutions which give power and continuity, and even deeper than that is what I call the deep Judeo-Christian culture, which is biblical, very biblical centric. And the manifest destiny could be considered the American equivalent of Hindutva, or conversely you could say Hindutva is an Indian construction of manifest destiny, whichever way you want to look at it. And while there is enormous criticism of an Indian grand narrative which is totalizing and so forth, Indians haven't really done the same gazing at the American grand narrative, which goes even further back, which has even more power on the world stage and so on. So one of my slides would be to compare the Hindutva grand narrative and the manifest destiny grand narrative, and I'll put columns up later on and tell you something about it. Then I said that besides these internal drivers of America, there are some external pressures. There is a clash with China, which is based on who is more modern, who has a better industrial complex, who has manufacturing economy of scale and better profit margins and efficiencies. And America the father is now fighting its son, which is very difficult because the son is trained by the father and knows everything the father has to teach. So fighting your own son in modernity and in industry terms is not going to be easy. And the second is the famous clash of civilizations, which is between one fundamentalism and another fundamentalism. And there too, the Islamic fundamentalism is an offspring of Judeo-Christian prophetic traditions. So they've derived a lot of their theologies from that. And so in that case too, one might say proverbially, America is the father fighting its own son. So we have a father fighting two sons, and neither son wants to quit or give up, and the dad is therefore has a lot of anxiety. So when you look at the internal drivers and these external pressures, these are in the background they operating when you want to look at what would the eagle be thinking of India. So then I moved to the point that deconstructing India has become very fashionable, has been exported very successfully to third world intellectuals who differentiate themselves from their peers in their universities or wherever they are working, based on how much foreign legitimacy and endorsement, and how many foreign symbols they have, how many visas they have stamped, and how many different kinds of symbols of their association with the West. And this import of ideology into India is of a kind of ideology which is not necessarily consumed domestically. It's sort of an export variety. It's sort of for export only and not necessarily practiced at home. And so this led me to the idea that we have the creation of sub-nations, all kinds of sub-nations, fragmented identities in India being given ideological importance by intellectuals, while the nation as a collective entity being given not only less importance but also denigrated and also deconstructed. So India's plight is sandwiched between the South Asianism on the outside putting pressures and subnationalism on the inside putting pressures. So these are some of the points I made, and then I had a slide showing the position of the corporate sector in America towards India, the position of the government sector, the position of the church, the position of the academy, both in each case both the public relations posture and the reality, a rather complex slide. So with all that in the background, what I want to talk about is focusing on how India is studied. And this byline is saving Indians from India. You could also say saving India from Indians. I guess you could look at it both ways. But this byline says we'd like to save the individuals, give them better, better clothes and food and so on. But in order to do that, the collective cultural capital called civilization, called nation, may have to be compromised because they are being held hostage, they are being held victims of that. And this is a very sinister kind of game to convince a whole lot of people that their problem is in fact their collective capital. So in that sense I'm saying saving Indians from India. Now why are India studies important? India studies is how college educate the college students in mainstream America, including school teachers, media, political and business leaders of tomorrow. The Indian students who are there's about 85,000 Indian students in America, and also another about 90,000 second generation NRI kids in America. Their identities are being shaped, often institutionalized re-engineering into South Asian. This is a very common trend. There is influence on US and Indian think tanks from the American study of India. There is a lot of mimicry by intellectuals in India. I'll talk about that. Value of the culture, value of Indian culture as soft power and its cultural capital are affected by the way it's studied. And human rights depend on perceptions of a group. Some people, it seems, have more human rights than others because some people are more worthy than others. And this is an important point. Now, my background is among various things. One of the things I did was as an industry analyst, industry consultant, a management consultant, worked for large multinationals analyzing entire industries, very, very complex industries. And when I started looking at India studies, I brought many perspectives. One of them was the perspective of looking at it as an industry. And I was surprised nobody had done that. Nobody had really looked at India studies as a knowledge industry. When you look at an industry, you look at production, distribution, retailing and consumption, and you come up with what are the segments, what are the specialties for each of these, and how are these things controlled. Is it vertically integrated? Is there somebody who controls the production and the distribution such that it's almost like a cartel or a monopoly? I'm going to raise that issue here. So the knowledge production, to do that, to analyze it, one has to look at academic research and think tanks. To look at distribution, one has to look at journals, conferences, academic presses, reports. These are the channels through which they are distributed. And retailing happens in classrooms, media, etc. And one finds upon analysis, and I'll bring this out later, that a certain group of producers tend to control these journals, conferences, academic presses, reports. So really, if you want your work to be distributed, a certain producer or club of producers, you have to actually say something that they will accept, because they control the distribution channels. Now, mind you, if something like this happened in the regular industry, it would be a case for antitrust action. If a certain producer of clothes had control over dominant retail channel distribution and others were denied access, or if somebody like Walmart that owns a large amount of retail shelf space for shoes and clothes and various kinds of consumer goods, if it could be shown that they actually have an interest in a certain kind of producer of these goods, and then that vertical integration would give them control over a critical bottleneck, and that would be grounds for antitrust action. This sort of question even has never been raised. So I'll talk about that, and of course I discussed the role of business, government and church in funding all these things, in funding the production of knowledge, distribution of knowledge, retailing of knowledge. So my methodology comes from a very formal discipline of management consulting, and that's the methodology I used to study this industry. So I'll give you some of the highlights of my conclusions. I'm planning a book which will have a lot of data and facts and all that stuff, but I want to give you some highlights today and then we can discuss. So I'm examining social sciences as an industry, examining India studies as a knowledge industry, who controls India studies, why, how, what are the funding mechanisms, what are the critical bottlenecks, are there related party transactions. This is very interesting. Even though there may be separate entities involved, in the business world, if these are related parties, then you have the possibility of a cartel or a monopoly. And I've been looking for the last many years, and I find many instances where these are related parties indeed that are controlling a particular specialized discourse. What are the trends? What are the implications of being an object of foreign study? Indians should be thinking about it, because Indians are the object of a huge amount of India studies going on, and Indians haven't bothered to even understand how this works. What are the sources of biases? And I do not posit a conspiracy theory, but I do posit that there are certain patterns. And I don't know if these are intentional, unintentional, what they are, and so I don't want to overinterpret them either. I have done a lot of case studies from some specific universities, certain disciplines like religious studies, like South Asian studies. I've been looking at discipline-wide. I've also looked at certain conferences, like there's the American Academy of Religion annual conference. I've been attending and examining what they do about Indian religions. South Asian Studies has a conference for the last 30 years with about 500 people attending in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They've produced almost 5,000 papers over the last 30 years. Nobody has analyzed what are they doing, you know. So I look at the different case studies. Our foundation has done American Public Attitude Surveys. We gave a grant to University of Texas, Austin, and we found nobody had ever done a survey on what the average American thinks about India. And we don't have very large data, but the preliminary data suggests what some major areas of prejudice are. And we gave grants for analysis of media and film biases, Hollywood biases. Scholars in Penn State did that. We've been looking at school textbooks and curriculum analysis. I myself serve on the New Jersey committee. We work with people in Texas, in New York school systems. There's a big fight right now going on in California school textbooks. Huge fight has broken out between Indian groups that want to change some of the portrayal and some academic scholars that are very well entrenched into the old systems of thinking that are fighting back with superior credentials. I might add. They have the credentials and the legitimacy and the Sarkari stamp on their side, and they don't want to topple what is their scholarship, which has filtered into the school system. They don't want to topple that. So if you think NCRT was a big fight here, we have plenty of such fights going on in the US. It's not only Indian groups, it's Native American groups, it's African groups, it's Jewish groups, it's Islamic groups, it's all sorts of people who have fights with the way the school textbooks have been written in the past. There are other cultural representations. I've been studying the Japan Foundation, how they operate. They've been very successful. They created How to Teach Japan, DVD and training system to teach school teachers, and they claim they've trained 10,000 American school teachers over the past 20 years. They've set up 5 centers all over the US with their curriculum and the whole works. So you come for a few weekends and then you get a certificate, and then after that you come for an advanced training and then you get $500, and then if you teach it in your school then you get flown to Japan for a seminar. So they've got a really good system on how to do that. There's a China Institute which does some amazing things. There's a Korea Foundation. There are many Jewish groups. There are many Islamic groups. There is Tibet House. There is no one doing something similar for India. Now, Marxism looks at knowledge production. Looks at industrial production. Who controls the means of production? And then you define who's the capitalist and who's the proletariat and bourgeois and so on. But what I'm doing is a similar methodology, looking at knowledge as an industrial process, saying who controls knowledge production. And what I'm finding is that there are some institutional processes which encourage certain theories and methods to be used, and these theories and methods result in certain conclusions, the truths, and these in fact perpetuate the institutional processes, and these tend to be controlled by a dominant culture. Now, if you look at where the money comes from, the US government has a program called Title VI, which was enacted as an act of US Congress in the Cold War to study certain non-Western areas. South Asia became one of them. And this funding is going to a whole lot of colleges, and they organize many things. There's also indirect funding via private foundations, and also some collaborations which are kind of unofficial collaborations with church groups when it comes to foreign issues. There are Christian seminaries. It's amazing. Right near where I live is one of the most powerful Christian seminaries, the Princeton Theological Seminary. And they have about a dozen scholars on the faculty who study Hinduism. It's amazing. There's a guy who studied Vaishnavism, there's another guy who studied some particular text, there's someone else, and you wonder why are they doing it. And when you get to know them and interact with them, in the corporate world, this would be called competitive research. This is what we called. You work in a company, you have a lot of people who study another company, their products and their operations, their activities. And these people are very deeply versed. They come and they spend 20, 30 years, they get credentials in India, they study with Pandits, they live here like Indians. That is their purpose in life. They are very hard working. They work in the hinterlands, in the villages. It's not some desk job, they do a lot of field work. So they have fairly deep resources in the teaching of Indian religions in the United States. Western secular universities, the Ivy Leagues on down, study India a lot. They have departments. It's interesting, India doesn't have India studies. Western controlled human rights groups, they are into studying India. Foreign funded Indian NGOs serve as data hunter-gatherers. So you can be a hunter-gatherer in charge of looking for a sati somewhere. You go into Rajasthan, if you find one, you quickly report and to the next level up, and if he validates it, it goes to somebody who knows how to write polished English, and finally it ends up in a foreign source, and you may be invited. You may have hit a big jackpot. Or if you're not into a big jackpot, more mundane, you can gather data on dowry abuse, or you can gather data on something of interest. And these are hunter-gatherers, data hunter-gatherers in the hinterlands of the third world. And there's a whole pyramid structure supplying data to the theory makers. The theory makers come from the first world, and the third world people fill in the data. Marginalized are, this was my role as a diaspora leader, bringing awareness to the Indian diaspora that our kids are being taught all kinds of stuff when they leave home, and we don't even know what they're being taught. So the government of India is nowhere to be seen. You try talking to an embassy or a consulate, and they'll say, "Arey, we're not supposed to. We don't know. We're not even sure what they're supposed to do." Indian language scholars are marginalized. It's pretty much an English language game, unfortunately. So you have to already have crossed a certain threshold of alienation from nativity, from your indigenous culture, and be able to write good English, write in a certain style of English to be even considered a scholar. And truly independent voices, for example, Dr. Lokesh Chandra sitting right here, and many others that we've had the pleasure of working with, you find that they are not adequately represented. Their works are not what's read and studied. You'll be quite surprised at the names of who are supposed to be the experts on our tradition. Most of those names the average Indian would never have heard of. India, this is an important point. India is the largest civilization I know of whose study is driven from the outside. Now, if you look at China studies, it's very interesting. I went to a conference and there was this American scholar of China. So we were just having some, sitting at a table talking, and he was giving me some insight into Chinese history of some kind, and he said, I'll never write this. I said, why won't you write it? He said, because it will upset the Chinese. So I said, why should it matter to you? He said, well, you know, it's controlled in China. They control the journals, they control access to the information, they control a lot of the conferences. So the China studies is China-centric, and the Westerners have to kind of make their way in, or feel if they feel left out or blocked out, it's bad news for their careers. India studies is just the opposite. In India studies, you have to really prove how un-Indian or anti-Indian you are to work your way into America. And if you are very successful, you get access. Because we don't have libraries here with all the information. They have libraries. More books are published on India, many kinds of India stuff overseas. The price is unaffordable. You're not going to find it in Indian scholars' libraries. So, whereas they can easily afford to buy everything that's published here. So, it's the asymmetry is very strong in favor of the West studying India. But China has taken this matter very seriously. Now, I'll give you a very simplified view of how India is deconstructed. There are secular lenses which include both Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, postmodernism. The Enlightenment lenses including things like anthropology, social theory, history, Western feminism, and postmodernism has a whole lot of different kinds of theoretical lenses. And then those who are into the American right, which is very substantial group amount of scholarship, use Abrahamic categories. They have missionary agendas, and they're appropriating, like Christian yoga as being kind of an appropriation, or it's a denigration. So there are two. There's the left approaching and the right approaching. Unfortunately, both India is kind of the study of India is kind of squeezed and sandwiched from both sides. So the study starts with generally looking at caste, minority religions, women, and their problems. So the beginning is, let's study some problems, rather than what are some resources, what are some things they have to offer, what are some things they have already done for humanity. So it starts off by with problems, and then it works its way up. These problems are characterized, considered sort of the foundation of Hinduism, which is considered the foundation of Indian civilization, which is considered the foundation of an Indian nation state. And so the problematization is driven in this manner, and it works its way up. Some people work at one level, some work at another level. Very few really put it all together. But if you become a student of how this industry works, you will find out that the composite effect is a deconstruction of all of this. So there are some what I call centrifugal ideologies, and they are as follows. There is the Freudianization of Hindu deities, gurus, symbols, and societies. There's a whole Wendy Doniger school that I've been having a lot of fights with for the last 5 years. They are pretty prominent in, for instance, they came out with this theory that Ganesh represents a limp phallus. This is one of the prominent things. And it made its way into some major museums, art museums, where school children are taken, kids, impressionable kids are taken to get their idea on Indian culture. So this sort of thing happened, and then of course it started, I wrote some articles, it started some big arguments and fights. Another theory was that Sri Ramakrishna was a homosexual, and then there was an allegation that he sexually abused Vivekananda when Vivekananda was a kid. This started a big uproar, and then some very vulgar, obscene kind of things about the goddess. So there is this sort of Freudianizing with the attitude that anything goes, because, you know, hey, I'm analyzing what's the collective subconscious of these Indian people, and if they don't understand it, that's really because it's subconscious. And that combined with academic freedom as cover has given a whole lot of momentum to this. But there's an active fight going on from both sides. Then there is this caste, evil Brahmins framework, which leads to the study of Dalit, Sati, dowry, etc. And then it turns into the hands of human rights activists. And the sources are the same sort of governments, church, human rights, watch groups. And then the activism, there's a lot of sepoys, I call them intellectual sepoys, media, NGOs, they get into the act. And this idea that India is not a nation is become quite interesting trend. I'll show examples of that in places like South Asian Initiative at Harvard. Now, it's very interesting. If you go to do a Google search on Harvard, South Asia, initiative, and you'll come to their homepage. And that homepage is very nice, cover page, nice pictures, a lot of nice stuff about how great is India and how we're studying India and whatnot. And most Indians would find it quite interesting. Then you do a search called forums. Actually, on the left column, there's a button called forums, but even if there isn't, do a search called South Asia forums. And you land on a page which lists 10 forums. And these are not 10 out of 50 that I've picked. These are the 10. That's it. These are the 10 forums. Now, I'm not claiming that this is all they study. Obviously, they study a lot of things. But these are the 10 things, the 10 categories they considered important enough to make into an individual forum. And each forum has hundreds of articles, papers, databases, statistics being supplied, names of scholars, contacts in India to who any American scholar can contact as a data hunter-gatherer if they need help, and so on. So these 10 forums are dowry, domestic violence, crimes against women, feticide, child marriage, girl child, sati, pregnancy and nutrition, tribals, injectable contraceptives. These are the 10 categories. So the question is, who decides and on what basis do they decide? That's what India is about. That's the forum. I could come up with all sorts of alternative categories, maybe much more balanced. And then the interesting thing is 90% of the negative case studies. So when they're doing case study of one of these, 90% of the time it tends to be about India, even though it's South Asian studies. So that's an interesting, and I've given you the URL here. Then there is themes in politics, which is heightened perception of volatility and security risk. This seems to be a theme. Hyphenating India to Pakistan, this is a very, very common theme. Using Pakistan and or Kashmiri separatist lens to study Kashmir. A lot of activists and separatists under the guise of self-determination, forums and conferences, they get invited. Partition is seen from Jinnah's perspective as something that Hindus wanted because they couldn't give equal rights to Muslims. This sort of a theory is there. Human rights of separatists and subversives. So India's integrity is challenged, A, externally by South Asianism, B, internally by subnationalism. So this is, Harvard is a very important case study I'm doing. I've downloaded lots of stuff that they're doing, and I'm busy analyzing. This will be a fairly large section in my book. So there is an anti-India grand narrative which has the following components. Anti-progress is a very common theme. It's primitive, frozen, poverty-causing. It's a patient with these diseases, caste, sati, dowry, feticide, untouchability, incest, all of that. It's unscientific. Indians shown as mystical, Westerners as rational. Everything good about India was imported. So the so-called Aryans brought Sanskrit, Greeks brought his philosophy and rational thought. Hinduism was a Sufi and Canolian construct. And this is very interesting. Jack Hawley of Columbia University believes that bhakti is a derivative of Sufism. And he's got a huge following, he's a prominent writer. Indian culture was started by the Mughals, so the tandoori chicken, tikka, tabla, that's, it's very interesting. You go and get a seminar on Indian civilization. If it's a positive thing, it starts with the year 1500. It's amazing how many courses start with the year 1500. British gave Indians a nation and cricket. And of course, the implication is we must now import our human rights from America. I call this the invasion theory of India, which means that the history of India is a series of invasions. And these invasions gave us who we are. And we should be very proud that we can handle these invasions. We can really take it with greatness, how much we can handle this. And so if we have a problem, we now have to figure out who's next guy best qualified to invade us, and that'll be good. So the implication is we're doomed to dependency and mimicry. To progress, Indians must stop being Indian. And this is what I meant, saving Indians from India. Now a lady sitting there yesterday asked the question on what's wrong if Americans are taking charge of helping the elites. And I put up this slide, I'll put it up again because some of you might not have been here. My question was, my position in response to her was, assuming Indian society to be a patient, one, are Western institutions qualified to cure Indian society? I mean, can they show that they have a cure? Have they cured anyone else? I mean, you don't just go to a doctor and submit yourself blindly. You want to do some checking and due diligence first. What is the past track record of Western powers intervening in third world domestic issues? And this would be an interesting study. This is a study in itself that people need to do first. what accountability do they have as doctors? Like if something goes wrong, do they just pack up their bags and leave and say, okay, fine, we go to the next experiment? What's their liability and responsibility? Does the West have a superior human rights record of its own? That's an interesting study. I mean, if you look at number of policemen in India, it's trivial in proportion to population compared to the United States. There are so many thousands of villages that have no police chowki, no police station. But and the law and order is, you don't require external policing to keep basic law and order. Whereas in the United States, every municipality, the tiniest village certainly has a bunch of police people. So if you look at, if you scale the amount of law enforcement money and number of people and amount of weaponry to the population, India would have to increase its policing by a huge order of magnitude to have a comparable amount. So there are certain things, you can do comparisons in per capita, various kinds of crimes, crimes against women, crimes against children, and so on and so forth. In a book by Veena Oldenburg, she compared dowry murder in Delhi with New York scaled to population, and she found that in the United States it's not called dowry murder, it's insurance killing. You don't have gold as that the guy will take, but there is an insurance policy whose benefactor would be the husband, and so the insurance companies go and sue people who they think have killed their spouse to get that policy, so that would be the equivalent of a dowry death. And she went and got these statistics. It's an interesting book called Dowry Murder, where she starts by showing how merely asking this question to her feminist colleagues saying, I want to study, they frowned upon it. They just didn't think that this was worth studying. They said, what do you mean dowry murder in New York? We don't have such a problem. So she had to really fight hard even to get statistics, because no one is bothering to even track statistics. But when all this was done, she found when scaled for population, New York was no less in terms of rate of what we would call dowry murder. Are human rights definitions and case selections biased? I mean, we select certain kinds of problems and we problematize them, but we don't select other problems. Are Western agendas constructing categories of cultural crimes? You know, if there's a murder in somewhere in Trenton or Newark or New Jersey, we don't have headlines saying Christians killed somebody, even though the people probably are Christians. So it is not superimposed what their religion is and stuff like that. If they are black, it would probably be saying blacks did it, kind of thing. So somehow there is a framing of crime, framing of problems in terms of somebody's cultural identity. The question is, who gets to select which cultural identity is going to be used to frame and which one is not, because you can play games with it, it's rather subjective. Are Western, then do Indian globe-trotting activists have personal vested interests? This is another interesting thing. I track Indian activists who go around involved in these things and organizing a whole lot of campus documentaries on how horrible India is, and on radio stations, and giving testimony in Washington and things like that. And it's very interesting to see who these people are, where they're funded, and what their trajectories are. I'll give some biases, I'll give examples of biases in India studies. First, unequal treatment, academic treatment of India and the US in the following sense. India's problems in the American Academy are often framed as Hindu. USA's problems are not framed as Christian, but their majority is Christian. You could just as easily find some reference in the Bible as you find in Manusmriti, and you could say, well, because it's written in the Bible, they must be doing all this. Just like saying, well, Manusmriti said it, they must be doing this. Even though, quite frankly, I've never come across a person in my whole life who read the Manusmriti, except Indologists, except academic Indologists. I don't know anybody in my family, anybody who gets up in the morning and reads Manusmriti to decide how to conduct themselves. But still somehow it's blamed that way, as though there is some kind of a cause effect going on. Success of affirmative action and pluralism is downplayed. I mean, we don't have a whole lot of academic work and case studies on how affirmative action has succeeded in India. But in America, it's played up. When there's a presidential address or there's some kind of an event, there's in the front row, there's some black sitting there, there's some other minority sitting there, and they stand up and say how proud we are, we're great Americans, But we don't do that kind of a PR. However, in the United States, while that is the impression given, you go to an inner city black neighborhood, ask them if this represents their plight, and they'll tell you it doesn't. So there's a certain packaging that I think is quite different. Minorities who condemn India are encouraged. I mean, there's a whole parade of Indians who are invited with nice treatment, nice grants and visas and all that to give these talks to show how they are being ill-treated by their nation. Minorities who are patriotic are given importance and projected in the US. Indian classics are considered chauvinistic and human rights problems. But biblical, Greek, Roman classics are considered useful to students and not seen as Western chauvinism. This is very interesting. You go to a classics department, there's very rarely a classics department where they'll be teaching Indian classics at par with Western classics, maybe one or two in the entire country. Quite a few have started teaching Chinese classics because of the diaspora pressure. Positives in the case of India like yoga, meditation are decoupled from India and classified as either pop culture or some generic Eastern wisdom. Western civilization's continuity and superiority are emphasized, its values and myths are universalized. Indian secularism is positioned against its majority religion. So it's like if you are in your majority religion, which is Hinduism, that's positioned like being unsecular, anti-secular. But in the United States, there is respect in the mainstream for Christianity in the government, media, culture, and that is your acid test for being a secularist is not to show how distant you are from your Christianity. You don't have to be un-Christian or certainly not anti-Christian to be secular. You're a good, proud Christian, very happy, proud of it, and you put up your Christmas tree in your office and you give Christmas cards and you sing Christmas carols in the office and all that stuff, and you're secular. There's not that contradiction like we think there is. India's pluralism is underappreciated. Most government in India, most government faith-based funding goes to minority religions. We have actually a survey going on in this. Since independence, and this has been through every government, it hasn't been tampered with. The central government gives a lot of grants for social work. There's a certain article, a certain funding mechanism. And rightly so, much of this goes to Christian and Islamic social groups. They are better organized, they need help, and so it's a good idea. They should get that. I'm very happy that happens. But in the United States, most government faith-based initiatives go to Christian groups. A few years ago, people started debating, what happens if some Hare Krishna want this grant or some Islamic groups wanted grant. It created a very big debate and a very big stir. But in India, we already have been giving minorities preference in government funding. The government in India funds Hajj pilgrimage. The government in the USA doesn't do this. I had a photograph of this Indira Gandhi airport. It said Hajj terminal going this way. I had a photograph like that. And in the United States, in various groups, I showed it. I said, we have a Hajj terminal in every major city. Now, we don't have such a Hajj terminal in JFK or in Washington or any United States airport. People thought that this photograph was not real. People just couldn't believe that this is true. I said, that's true, this is true. But the presentation of information is so filtered, people find it hard to believe that we would actually have a special government facility for Hajj pilgrimage, which I think is a good idea. But the Americans just have a hard time believing it. We have a separate civil code for Muslims and no such thing in the United States. There's higher reservation quotas in India than in the US. There's better minority representation than in USA in many areas. For instance, it might surprise you, there is no black senator right now in the US Senate, not one. It's very interesting.
What about Obama?
Okay, you might say that's one. No, that is not a senator. Okay, he's an appointee. A senator is public vote. Appointee is, you have Condoleezza Rice, those are political appointees. And you can appoint to have a nice decorated multicultural cabinet. But I'm looking at what does the people vote. And then you look at, there needs to be a comparative study of India versus USA, progress of minorities of the past 50 years. You have to look at the representation of minorities in two countries, women in the two countries, things of that sort. I mean, there it's even a fight going on whether gays have a right to be in some jobs or not. In India, there's no such law against them in the first place, so they don't need to have a.
There is, it's still in old British law, which still hasn't been.
But is it enforced?
Yes, well, I mean, I don't know if they go and catch them, but it certainly exists.
Okay.
In fact, gays have made a demand for it to be.
Okay, well that's interesting. I'm glad you brought it to my attention because I haven't seen a grey activism in here. presumably because but gays exist, but they're sort of not out there, visible or
They were close to the National Human Rights Commission.
they have. Okay, then I'm glad. Okay, then. But that's a British law?
Yes.
Okay, okay, well, okay. I'd be interested in some scholar later when we're having a discussion telling me whether in pre-British Indian culture and civilization, whether opposition of gays was ever institutionalized by the state. I mean, just a curiosity I have. I'd like to learn for my own self. The Indian government controls Hindu temple, trusts, donations collected and budgets. When you suggest that as a benchmark of secularism, as a mark of secularism to Americans, and suggest that the government might control Christian institutions, you get this big hell no. It would never be happen. It could never be tolerated in the United States. Now, we study Hindutva influences, but we do not study American manifest destinies influences. For instance, scholars rightfully study the BJP influence over textbooks, which is it's important to study that. The Hindutva archaeology, Hindutva historiography on Ayodhya and other places. But I haven't seen scholars study the influence on South Asian studies from US government, Christian institutions, secular institutions, private foundations, advocacy groups, and Indian scholars who have political agendas, who are linked to a political party. I haven't seen reports on how this shapes South Asian studies in America, which would be an equivalent thing to do. Now, there was a report on IDRF operating Indian tribal schools. I'm very glad such a report exists. But I would also like to see a report on Christian schools in Indian tribal areas, madrasas in Indian tribal areas. I'd like to see a report which shows all the non-secular institutions, who's doing what, right, wrong, whatever. I mean, if a particular group is teaching against birth control, against population control, that would be anti-national. Whoever they are, if they are teaching anti-Indian, un-Indian identity, if they are teaching that a separatist identity is a better idea for you, that would be a problem. I would like to see such reports happen for everybody. As IDRF report is a good idea, but why insulate other people? So my question is the academy studying only one direction of prejudice? Now, there are some links made and some links neglected. Caste and Hinduism is a very popular link, but caste in Indian Christianity is a prevalent thing. Caste in Indian Islam is also a prevalent thing. I don't see them featured much in South Asian studies. Dowry extortion and Hinduism is routine study, but dowry extortion in other religions is not given the same preference. And dowry extortion based because of consumerism, modernity. You see, when a person wants dowry, he's not looking for a Ganesh made of gold. He's looking for a dishwasher or a scooter or a car or a microwave or a television. It is not something Hindu that he's asking for. It is in fact against the ethos of a frugal, simple life, sattvic life. So it's hardly a Hindu problem. The person may happen to be a Hindu, but it's a problem of modernity and greed, because the consumerism creates unnecessary wants beyond what the needs are, and this creates greed, which creates corruption, and dowry extortion is a form of corruption. It really has nothing to do with being a Hindu. Social problems are conflated with Indian culture, especially Hinduism, but in the US, I didn't see social problems in Christian Islamic third world countries being conflated, and nor social problems in America's own poor being conflated with their religion. The historical origins of India's problems are often ignored. We're doing 20 volumes on history of Indian traditional knowledge systems, traditional science and technology. So when you look at the iron technology, which was supreme in India, the jatis that did it, that were the manufacturers and exporters. You look at zinc technology, which pioneered in Rajasthan. The first distillation of pure zinc was done in Rajasthan, and many tons a year were exported. These are well documented, and international metallurgists accept this. The communities involved were jatis, which are today classified as most backward caste, scheduled caste, whatnot. So there is a historicity for their downfall. At some point in time it happened. Why it happened? This has not been adequately studied, and it's simply assumed that these are permanent problems that were eternal problems because of the eternal India with its fixed caste system and so on and so forth. So the context is often decontextualized and then miscontextualized. Topics encouraged and topics discouraged. There is a lot of empirical data gathering going on in India, But I'm interested in surveys on what do Americans think of India, where are they misinformed, where are their prejudices, and I had to start the first such survey because it wasn't there. Nobody had bothered to do that. You would think that we would want to know what the average person's impressions are and where the problems lie. India's discontinuity over time, India's geographical fragmentation, India's divisiveness and conflicts, these are encouraged. Continuity with progress of Indian civilization over time, pan-Indian commonalities, pan-Asian civilization discouraged. When I served as chairman of the Asian Studies Commission, we wanted to find out what are the Asian equivalents of we said we need Asian emphasis, everybody agreed on that. So one of the lesson sections in world history is Western spread of civilization, how the West spread civilization. So they wanted to know if Asians have some equivalent example. So I said, well, the spread of Buddhism, and I gave Dr. Lokesh Chandra's books and all, as for them to read, and Bob Thurman also added some weight there. I said that the spread of Buddhism as a civilization across Asia deserves including in something called spread of civilizations. And the argument was that there was no invasion, who conquered, there was no, it's sort of like there's a certain idea that there's an invading army that goes, takes civilization, and that's how civilization spreads. And this thing may have happened very informally by word of mouth, some monk coming, some scholar going, and I said, yeah, that is how it happens in India. So this idea of pan-Asian spread of civilization is not been adequately treated. Human rights problems stemming from Indian culture, very much there in this discourse. Human rights resources in Indian culture. What are the Indian resources of pluralism? How have we been managed for a long time to have such a large diversity of cultures, identities, communities, and so on, without a sort of systematic genocide or an attempt to go out and conquer others and stuff like that? So what are some positive resources we have? Human rights problems also caused by Abrahamic religions is not adequately studied. It's not given the same treatment as the human rights problems in the Indian traditions. Rights of individuals are very important, but what about rights of cultures? I mean, what happens if a language dies, it goes extinct? I mean, that's a problem. But if a species of animals goes extinct, there are lots of people organized to worry about it, track that. If a species of plant goes extinct, but what happens if a language goes extinct, if a culture goes extinct, if a religion goes extinct? Aren't cultures a sort of capital, a form of collective capital that also belongs to people? So shouldn't a culture have rights? Raising this last one is very controversial, exceedingly controversial, because what they've done is create this doctrine which says culture belongs to nobody, so therefore it cannot have a right. It's just kind of universal property. So it's not defensible because there is no one to defend it. Now, in the United States, there is academic religious studies. The American Academy of Religion has 13,000 members. They are teachers, faculty, research people. In India, we don't have academic religious studies, so what I'm talking to you about does not have an Indian equivalent. But this is one of the most important departments in liberal arts, humanities, social sciences is religious studies. One of the largest enrollment of students goes into this kind of a department. It's a very trendy thing in America to study world religions. So if you look at the American Academy of Religion, who the members are of Judaism studies, Islamic studies, Buddhism studies, all kinds of different types of groups that it's broken into, you find that Judaism studies is almost 100% done by rabbis, insiders. Islamic practitioners are prevalent. I mean, it's a very large percentage of them are Islamic practitioners, and they're very proud to be, imam, mufti from some place. They are the teacher. Buddhist practitioners have dominated Buddhism studies. Generally, white people who are Dalai Lama's followers or Zen practitioners, but they are very Buddhist in their ways. And Christian seminaries are a good counterbalance to the secular critique. If you do a census of the 300 or 400 people in the unit that studies Indian religions, you'll find maybe 10 to 20% are practicing Hindus who are actually doing the research and teaching on Hinduism. So it's a very underrepresentation of insiders. There is something called constructive Christianity and liberation theology. This says that Christianity doesn't have to be judged by its past. We can make it modern, we can make it Marxist friendly. That's what liberation theology is. We can have new constructions, we can make it feminist friendly, and so on. There is no such study of constructive Hinduism, except there's a few people I know in the audience who are actually doing that, but very few. And generally they're depicted as chauvinists because they're trying to give it a modern spin. There is a very active field called Buddhist social theory. There are the liberal possibilities in Islam. There's a lot of topics on, is there feminism possible in Islam? Can Islam be democratized? I mean, they're looking for positive angles, but I don't see the academy doing that. In fact, those who do that are generally are considered some sort of chauvinists. There's a study of Islamophobia. If you go to Google and just type Islamophobia, you'll get 27,000 hits. 27,000. So there's a lot of discussion on the existence of Islamophobia. And I'm glad there is, because any phobia should be studied. People should study phobia against any culture. It should be studied. Why should there be phobia against any culture whatsoever? But there's no, if you say there is prejudice against Hinduism, that is not accepted. People say there isn't. There's a denial of that. But we know cases, we know lawsuits, we know cases concerning textbooks. We have so many case studies that show that the problem does exist, but it's never been acknowledged. Somebody asked me before about what I think of Orientalism and Edward Said and so on. Post-colonialists emphasize certain things but not others. For instance, they critique British creation of Indology. They say, well, you know, from starting with the famous chair in Oxford to train East India Company people, they critique that whole history. But I haven't seen anyone critique the American creation of South Asian studies. I wonder why. Maybe many of the people who could critique are working in South Asian studies in America or offshoots of it in India. But I haven't seen a single critique by this postmodernist group of South Asian studies. I've seen a lot of critiques of British Indology. Criticism of dead scholars. I think it may have to do with the fact that it's easy to criticize a dead empire than a living one, and it's safer, and it's also easier to criticize scholars who've dead for many years. But if you criticize the living scholars, they might be your colleagues, they might be somebody who's going to do your peer review or something like that. You cannot really fall out of ranks. The critique of Enlightenment theories is in fashion in post-colonial studies, and that's a good idea. But not the use of Indian categories and theories. There's a lot of Indian theories which are sort of like postmodernism. A lot of postmodernist-like deconstruction exists also in Indian thought, but that is not being used. Study of Indian intellectuals who resist Eurocentrism these are the brave guys, the heroes. But what about the study of Indian intellectuals who are nowadays serving Western institutions? I haven't seen a study of Indian intellectuals studying in Western institutions now. There's a bottom-up subaltern view which says Indian civilization is hegemonic, because when you look at it from the Dalit point of view, it's up there big and it's hegemonic. But then there's also a top-down globalization view which says when you look at it from above, foreign civilizations are a threat to India, because then the same Indian civilization is a minority and is weak compared to the rest of the world. It depends on which view you take. Now, people have said, well, you're concerned about, why are you so touchy about criticism of India? We also criticize America. That's true. But I'm going to show you that it does not have the same effect. In America, all political parties are fiercely patriotic, never separatists. Fragments get contained and assimilated. That's not true in India. The national parties, Congress, BJP, CPM, combined represent only half the votes. Politics is fragmented. It's very interesting if you plot since independence of India, what were in each election, what were at the national level, what is the percentage votes and seats that went to parties that I would call fragments, that represent a region, ethnicity, a religion, some small identity but not a pan-Indian identity. It started very small at the time of independence. The fragments had a very tiny share of national votes, and now it's been growing all the time steadily. So it's not only going back and forth between Congress, BJP kind of shift, but also collectively the national parties have been losing share to fragments. This is not true in America. There is no fragmented party. There is no black party that has 3 votes in the Congress or something, and no Mormon party which has 5 votes which wants Utah to be separated. There is no Hispanic party which is linked to Mexico which says we should join Mexico and which has 20 seats. There's no New York party which says, you know, we are French and we should join Quebec and separate. There's no Native American party which says, you know, we have 3 votes in the Senate and we ought to do something. I mean, that type of fragmentation of politics is just not there. There's 2 parties, both are very patriotic, very nationalistic, very stabilizing, and therefore the criticism is just not going to have the same centrifugal effect. Academic dissent does not fuel socio-political fragmentation. Impotent anti-establishment scholarship. You can have all these scholars on the extreme left, you know, it really Chomsky type. But while they may be very popular with their kind, and Indians may be very excited when, you know, something like that happens, but nobody in the Senate, Congress, in the corporate world, in the churches, in the bastions of power where America really is strong, nobody there cares a darn about such people. I mean, they're just on the margins. They are not given prominence. They are not considered to represent American mainstream thought, which is very stable, conservative American. That's it. So these people are on the fringes. It's not true. Intellectualism in India is linked to the social fragmentation on the ground. The similar people in India are very linked to some party which has some seats and which has some agendas and which has some links with some foreign nexus and all that. They're very much more effective in India. No external enemies in domestic politics. There's no claim of territorial claim from a neighboring country, you know, that you have to worry about. In India, domestic politics is heavily invested, funded by foreign forces. I mean, there's people who have a stake in something or other. Corporate funding brings cohesion into America. The corporations are massively funding institutions to create a stable space, stable market, stable supply lines, stable society in America. It's not so in India. Maturity and prosperity of the nation state also is a stabilizing factor because they've been around more than 200 years. And socio-economic distress pressures national unity in India. Christianity is a unifying ethos, very, very strong ethos in the United States. The socio-religious fabric is challenged. It's not so unified. Epistemic privilege and home control. So the discourse is in their epistemology. It is the Western epistemology. It is their homegrown framing and paradigms in which the discourse happens, including criticism. While in our case, when we are criticized, it is not in terms of an Indian framework or our epistemology. We are subject to somebody else's framing, paradigms, epistemologies, and we have to defend ourselves by first learning that framework, which is their framework, just to be able to defend ourselves. It's like if I were tried in a court in a foreign language and that's the only language they heard, that would be pretty bad because I'd have to first submit myself and learn how to defend myself in that language. So the critique of America is a homegrown epistemology. The critique of India in this sense is actually Western epistemology, not Indian homegrown epistemology. So what are some of the mechanics of bias, mechanisms that produce this? What are the methodologies I claim lack objectivity? There are academic cartels that control specialties, and there are also individual biases. So there is this veil, there is the veil of objectivity, but if you look at framing, contextualizing and selection of the theories, funding agencies select the topics, unstated meta-narratives and codified conclusions are anticipated. Try submitting something which is really provocative and contrary to what a particular foundation is all about, and see what happens. Latest fashionable theories derive from biblical enlightenment and post-enlightenment ways of thinking. Distortion of Sanskrit words, which creates a problem for us. Critiques of the West are mainly supplied by the West. This is very interesting. I mean, a lot of Indian critiques about Middle East policy, it's sort of derived from what they are saying, you know. So it is not really a whole lot of independent individual work. How many Indians do you know who've gone and done anthropology of America or done social theory? I mean, what's the reverse gazing? It's hardly there. It's very trivial compared to the gazing inwards to us. The West licenses who is an intellectual. Tradition's own experts are marginalized. Attacks against the empowered dissenters. So if you say I'm empowered and I dissent against this whole academic establishment, you'll be attacked. Third world intellectual coolies are a cottage industry. This is your data hunter-gatherer type. There are many layers of arbitrariness and subjectivity. Truth is therefore a consensus of opinion leaders. It's not like in natural sciences. Maybe I have a problem because I was raised in physics and computer science, and the standard of truth and objectivity and provability and empirical evidence, I brought that mindset. And then I went to the corporate world where you argue your cases, you argue with logic, you argue your business plan, you argue, you prove your case, the other guy has to argue his side, and so lots of money and lots at stake, and so there are all these mechanisms which are far more objective. And then you have to submit yourself to external audits by other auditing firms and the government auditing, and there are all kinds of things. I found when I brought that standard of due diligence and thinking into the humanities and social sciences, it's just not there. So the question is, are there specialized academic cartels? Now, narrow specializations lead to very few experts. So if you have very few experts, you don't have competition. For instance, anthropologists rarely re-examine a village already studied by others. This means that if you question some anthropologist's data on this particular Ghatyali village in Rajasthan, they'll say, okay, get me some more data or some alternative data, but nobody else has been to that village. They're generally specialized in regions, jatis, communities, tribes, and so on, and one club focuses in one place, and they almost have a monopoly of data on that very micro region. Many texts are rarely studied, hence few experts could criticize them. Reliance upon reputation, therefore there is reliance upon reputation, hence brand management and legitimacy by association. So if I have been published in these journals, that's my credibility. If I have published with that guy, if that guy writes a reference letter, if I've been a visiting professor in that particular famous institution, it's all symbols I can associate with, and therefore I manage my brand. That's my credibility. That substitutes for what in the natural sciences would be considered objective thought. A few high-powered positions have great leverage. There's a scarcity of jobs compared to the demand. A few journals in a specialty control the distribution of ideas. A few individuals influence the editorial boards and selection committees. Falling out of line means blackballed for life, guilt by association. A lot of people come to me and say, hey, listen, don't put my name on it because I have a job, I don't want to be labeled and so on. So this sort of smear campaign is a problem for a lot of people. Related party transactions means I do something for you, you do something for me. This is called quid pro quo. In business, you get thrown in jail if you do that, because it's not. I mean, there has to be transparency and open disclosure. Peers who do peer reviews are often related. So it could be a mentor and his students. I could be your reviewer, you could be my reviewer. We could be serving on an editorial board, we could be serving on a committee. So I send you this paper, but next year I'm going to invite you to that conference, and so you get my paper through, this sort of a thing. I mean, there's this that goes on. People who are in the system know it and talk about it, but it's not polite to talk about it publicly. As one another's ideological producers, consumers. I'm producing something, my theories in history, you are in religion, you don't want to go and understand all the history, you just quote my theory of history, and if I'm an important person from a prestigious place, you are safe because you've quoted my theory of history. And similarly, you've done some work in religion and you've come up with some theory of what these people's religion is like, and as long as you are well regarded, you have a good reputation and all that stuff, it's safe to just quote you. And so what a whole lot of these multidisciplinary positions are a selection of theories and positions from various specialties rather arbitrarily. Because if you take a particular Freudian theory and just believe it, you could actually go to a psychology department and find out a whole lot of anti-Freudian theories which you have not adopted. So you arbitrarily adopt the use of a particular theory from another discipline. As long as you're quoting someone of high reputation, it's considered acceptable. How transparent are the relationships and due processes? India studies lacks a counterbalancing home team, which means while these biases exist for all cultures, Chinese have their home team. They'll hit back. You talk about their human rights, they've got a home team who will say, hey, what about your human rights? So they have a home team. India studies doesn't have a home team which is world class and on the world stage. Scholars' individual biases. Here is an interesting quote by a professor. He's telling his students this: what you privilege or problematize may be correlated with A, your own whim or will, B, your faith orientation, C, your formal starting point or perspective, and these in turn may be D, a function of your community membership and allegiance, E, your life history and sense of identity, F, your assumptions about what works or what is appropriate, or even G, outcomes of dialogues or arguments with others. And this is this guy's maxims for academic study of religion. Right? So that's how individually subjective the discourse is, the study is. There's a lack of disclosure of funding sources. People don't have to disclose, like in the business world, you have to be very transparent and disclose where your money comes from. For Indian scholars, West's resources and clout give it the power to license India experts. The hard power is funding of jobs, visas, travel grants and all that. The soft power gives prestigious awards, events and symbols of success. Careers depend on a few powerful cartel leaders. Indians who confess victimhood fetch market premium. If you go and say, actually I'm not only a scholar, but I was personally a victim of such and such thing about my culture, and I'm writing a personal narrative, a personal confession, it's very fashionable to do that. A lot of such stuff in English departments, cultural departments that goes on. Foreign nexus patronage and undisclosed political affiliations. I gave this yesterday. I won't go through this again, which I showed how certain establishments in the US have links with corresponding things in India, and the question is, are Indians being managed by Americans? Now this is an interesting, I'm on my second last slide. I have a model which says there is a kind of a game, a theater or a marketplace with two players. There is the dominant culture and there is the membership from below. These people from below want to be members. Each side gives something and gets something. So they assert power and they appropriate. From below they participate and they get some impact. I'll show you how it works. So the dominant culture asserts hard power, which is funding agencies, institutions, Uncle Toms, they are gatekeepers, sepoys, they are very hard, this is hard power. There's soft power in the way topics, categories are selected, frames are done, experts, theories and all that. Carrots like travel, visas, jobs, tenure, grants, awards and chairs. Censorship, and there are sticks, which means that if you don't fall in line, you can actually be having a problem. From the Indian side, participation, there are many categories in which an Indian can participate. You can say, I'm a native informant, so I'll be your listening outpost, I'll be a translator, I'll be a data gatherer, and they're often gullible. Victims, you can say, I'm a victim, I want to participate in your knowledge structure, classify me as a victim, and you can interview me and I'll tell you a whole lot of things. So I could be an abused woman, Dalit, minority, and so on, and I'll help you understand the demonic culture of which I'm a victim. Repackaging as scholarship, so someone can participate and say, look, in my college, I'll be the franchise holder of Derrida, or I'll be the franchise holder of Foucault or Freud, and I'll distribute this knowledge, so you can participate in that capacity. There's something waiting for you. There could also be a sahib to sort of perpetuate this thing, what I call kind of a new imperialism. And the privileges that such a person get are, they can become an intellectual member of the Western grand narrative. They can begin to feel like, gee, I'm almost Western now. Government officials might send their kids in Ivy Leagues if they participate in this way. Institutional posts and prestige can be waiting for you after retirement. Pundits and native informants get gifts and status. A lot of these naive pundits get taken for a ride. Of course, the losses is that traditional knowledge systems and epistemologies get lost. Cultural capital, soft power, identity and leadership get lost. And as far as the dominant culture are concerned, the appropriate hard assets, markets, cheap labor, military, geopolitics, intellectual property, they get soft power in the form of symbolic capital, brands, credibility, and a whole lot of Indian culture becomes ornaments and museum pieces, control over knowledge distribution channels. So there's a whole market model, there's a whole game going on in which a player says, I'll play this and I get this. The other guy says, okay, I play my chips, I'll play in this capacity and I want this. Now, people ask me after the last talk, are you pro-American or anti-American? And I said, gee, I don't know, but I hope that we're not using such simplistic categories. I have, so in response to that, I thought I'll make it a little easier. The first four, which are in green, are positive ratings for US posture towards India, and the bottom four, gray, are negative ratings. I think the business and professional Indian is doing quite well and has very good prospects in engaging with America, mainly because we've learned their system, we can play game, we can beat them at their own game, we're very smart and we're going to do very well. So short term is good. Long term, what is India's long term vulnerability? I mean, there are a lot of issues we can get into on that. Indians in US colleges are doing very well, but long term we need India based Nalanda like universities of knowledge export. We need to be a knowledge producing and exporting society like we once were. We need to have a HRD, people need to have a plan that says, we'll have 1 million foreign students in Indian universities, we'll be world class, this will force us to upgrade our own education system. And if you live in a knowledge society, you got to really focus on your whole education system, and that is an important point. Indian pop culture, while is doing well, there is also appropriation and distortions like Christian yoga. Fighting terrorism, I think there is a positive to it, but I think USA also has double standards on Pakistan. On the negative side, India studies in US. We should establish India studies within India. Where is India's theory making on USA? We don't have India's theory making on USA. Evangelism exported into India is destroying India's soft power and cultural capital and dividing Indians versus Indians, because it's based on a smear campaign against our soft power. Foreign interventions in human rights, we should require foreign funded NGOs to disclose publicly. There should be in the US there's a website called GuideStar or GuideNet or something like that. Every non-profit organization has to file a huge disclosure to the Internal Revenue Service, and it gets on the website. So you go to this website, it's free, it's available to everybody, you type a foundation's name and their last 5 years of disclosure pops up. Who you got money from, where you spent your money. All sources of funding above, I think, a certain threshold have to be named. You got to give the guy's name and address who gave you the money, and where you spent it. You have to give a detailed itemization, and you have to check boxes like: are you involved in politics? Did you fund any political ideology? And if you deny and it's found later, then you have committed perjury. If you check the box, then you have to have more forms giving full disclosure. So a research scholar can just go online and figure out a whole lot of what is going on behind the scenes with any particular non-profit organization. That sort of access to data doesn't exist. We have an FCRA, but it's not a publicly easily accessible thing where you can go and see what was the foreign remittance by region, by denomination, by whatever. You have to go out and do a lot of research and digging. Role of many Indian intellectuals chasing Western symbols of legitimacy, data suppliers to Western theorists. The India studies, you can look at it bottom up or top down. I'm looking at it, the prevailing bottom up lens is this, but I'm proposing a balancing top down lens to be added. The minority issues must be seen from below according to the bottom up view. Powerful geopolitical forces are co-opting the locals. Minorities must be studied as part of a global nexus in many cases. If Nagas are part of the Southern Baptist Church and the Southern Baptists say that they ought to be freed up from India, you have to look at it as the power of the whole global Southern Baptist establishment and say they are part of, they have those powers, rights, money, all of that. So when is the international capturing of a minority substantial enough that you have to see them in that light? At what point does that happen? I don't know, but there's an issue there. Human rights problems must be taken to global forums to fix India. This is a very big fashion. The other position is West controls the human rights discourse as a weapon but has little track record to fix others or itself. The bottom-up view says India as a nation state is the problem. Partition, women, Dalits, minority, religions. Fragments must be separated for empowerment. The top-down view says most nation states had similar problems in formation. Fragmenting would lead to decolonization, issues to be resolved within India. Bottom-up says humanities scholars are the experts on society. Professionals and businessmen, which means people like me, are unqualified for the discourse. The counter is global mechanisms are run like corporations. Indian corporate executives bring critical expertise often lacking in the humanities. The bottom-up view is the attitude towards Indian donors. When people go to write a big check to places like Harvard, attitude is businessmen to write their checks, have their pictures taken and get lost. Hey, we'll give you a nice Bharatanatyam dance, nice dinner, we've given you this photograph, all that. Now please, we are very serious scholars, you cannot really help us, we have to do all this truth and objectivity and all that stuff. So they make it have this aura. My view is that businessmen are key intellectual stakeholders who bring valuable new perspectives on globalization and institutional mechanisms of the West. This is the final slide. Now, question is there an Indian grand narrative? So what I have here is nation supported by Indian civilization, Hinduism, and then there are problems that Hinduism has of caste, minority religions and gender. So it's a 4-level structure. And on the right are people who give a red. Red means they attack all these four. So this is the ideology that says break India. Okay, and I've told you that there are such people around. On the other side is protect Hinduism, and they have two kinds. The extreme one says everything is good. We'll even defend all our very orthodox caste attitudes and so on. There's nothing to change. The Vedas, the ancient times were glorious days. We just have to go back to an ideological past. So they take this kind of a very orthodox view. And then there is a progressive Hindu who says, look, we do have all these problems. That's why there's a red dot at the bottom. We have these problems, but we can solve them within the context of our religion. We've solved these problems before, and we can solve them again. And so the more liberal Hindu would say, yeah, I'm for nation, civilization and Hinduism, but I certainly want to reform. Then you have people who want to secularize India, and I think there are three columns there. There are those who say, of course, we have these problems at the bottom that should be resolved. Not sure about Hinduism, let's not talk about it. I don't want to even deal with it. It's kind of a delicate subject, so they'd rather not, they're kind of neutral, or they like to avoid that subject. But they believe in something they call Indian civilization, although it's not sometimes very clear to them what exactly that is. Then there is the other who says, I'm not only against all these problems because I don't like any of these problems. I think Hinduism is incurable, so I'm also against Hinduism. I'm not even sure whether there is such a thing as Indian civilization, but I do like the Indian constitution. I've met some people who, and I asked them, what do you think of this? They said, well, I protect the Indian constitution. And you ask them, what, tell me more. No, I just defend the Indian constitution, and beyond that, I have nothing to say. So they like the idea of India as a nation state, but what it is underneath is either they're against it or they're kind of avoiding the issue. And then there's this kind of a person who is very explicitly against everything, but still would consider themselves to be a proud Indian. I mean, only if you attack India, I mean, if India loses cricket, they are upset, or if Kashmir will go away, they're upset. But other than that, they really don't care much about anything else. So my feeling is that a debate, a discussion that is needed is in this green box. My feeling is that this extreme Hindu orthodoxy is no good. It just won't work. This other extreme, which says India as a nation state must be disbanded, I think is a bad idea. It won't work. We'll just get recolonized. Where I stand is that these four columns represent a healthy range, a spectrum of positions that need to be debated, argued, and then reconciled, hopefully into some sort of a national consensus. What's common about these is that they all accept blue, nation is good, we do want India. They all accept red, we want to get rid of these problems. So we agree on some things. These four columns agree that we want to solve these problems, but we want to protect the integrity of India. And amongst us, we have many diverse views on, what's civilization and what's the role of the dominant religion in it and other minority religions and so on. I think this is an interesting, healthy debate, and where I want to conclude is that that's the sort of discussion I'd like to be part of. Thank you very much.
I am Sansar Chandra, advisor in People First, and we have got quite detailed information about this topic which you spoke yesterday and today. I would like to share only one thing with the audience here and with you. In America, there is a Hidden Mysteries book series published by Bridge of Love Publications, and the email is infoinfo@hiddenmysteries.com. And there are 13 books are there which give detailed account of the whole thing. In nutshell, there are 84 families who are bankers by profession, who control the world economy because they own the Bank of America and Bank of England. This includes the Queen of England and the Bush family and the Clinton family and Rockefeller and all that. And they have got a huge fund for that. And they are doing this thing not only for India but against the whole world. And now we have to sit together and find strategies to deal with them. Thank you. I want your reaction, sir, on this.
My reaction is that I'm not aware of this. Absence of knowledge doesn't mean that the thing doesn't exist. All I can tell you is I will go as a trained consultant, and based on empirical evidence, based on hard data, I'll go and make my studies based on what I'm able to find and verify.
My name is Dr.
This is Sohoni, I'm Vice President of the Indian Council of Cultural Relations. I merely wanted to ask, you used the phrase Hindu-Christian syncretism.
Yes.
And that some organizations were promoting that, and Hindu-Islamic syncretism. Could you please enlarge?
Well, you know, if you look at the early Syrian Christians in Kerala, they prior to the coming of the Portuguese, I mean, they were very very India friendly, native friendly, and in fact, their relations with the Hindus were very symbiotic. There are also, even now, there are denominations where the adoption of Indian culture, Indian symbols, even there are theologians, Christian theologians, who have tried to, like Raymond Panikkar, who tried to interpret Vedic, very profound Sanskrit scholar, tried to interpret Vedic thought and the Christian thought in a syncretic way. So it's not just, in some cases, just symbolism, like they will go and light agarbatti and have prasad and sit on the floor and do bhajans, but also theological syncretism. And I think you'll find a lot of syncretism with Islam through the Bhakti Sufi type of traditions. The point I was making is we have a history of wanting to not only coexist with one another, but also find ways of interweaving and all that, you know, borrowing and so forth. But the amazing thing is that I haven't come across a Christian Islamic house of worship or a Christian Jewish house of worship. I mean, even Christianity, very rigid boundaries, because it's membership based. We are not membership based. So when you are not membership based, you can belong to many of them at the same time. Nobody says that if you go and worship Vishnu, you shouldn't worship Shiva or this goddess. You can Mondays do this and Tuesdays do that, and nobody bothers. But if you are a Presbyterian, you are a Presbyterian. You don't go to a Methodist church. If you're a Methodist, you don't go to a Episcopalian church. It is membership oriented. So there's a certain institutional mechanism. You are kind of a shareholder. You've bought into a lifelong plan. You've been guaranteed a group package for all the members, and you give your loyalty to them. And your loyalty means you don't go around with anyone else. It's sort of like you're part of this club in a very exclusive way. So that type of institutionalization of religion. Most religions, you go to the Presbyterian church, if you have an ordinary member, and you ask them how many Presbyterians in America, he'll say 3.4 million, something like that. You go and ask some Vaishnava how many Vaishnavas in India, he'll say, I don't know, what do you mean how many Vaishnavas? I don't keep track of it. We are not membership based. It's not like Rotary Club will tell you how many members they have, and the Gymkhana Club will tell you how many members they have. Every denomination will tell you, you go to online sites, Encyclopedia Britannica, and they'll give you the number of Americans by denomination. The top 10 Christian denominations, how many Mormons there are, how many this there are, how many that there are. It's very interesting. I can quote you, I can show you those sites. So it's when you have a membership based concept of religion, then you have boundaries. And so then you can't have these hybrids so easily. Yes.
Rajiv, I think that we've come to a point of something that both Indians and even your presentation, by using the word syncretism, I think that there are some problems.
Yes,
there.
I agree. Yes.
Because I think that, and I was going to raise that at the end, because it's not syncretism.
Mm-hmm.
It is the nature of, if you say whatever, that Indian civilization is undefinable, which gives you the space of plural identities at every level.
Yes.
And I think that that is the point which has to be, and the other point of institutionalization, but the fact that you can at the same time, and therefore it takes you to the more fundamental question of the definition of the word religion,
Mm-hmm.
and religion as separated from organization.
Thank you. I'm Patrick Finley, and I'm an engineer and lawyer from the United States visiting India. One of the questions I have is, I saw the problems that you listed that were challenging, and of the ones, caste, gender, etc. Do you see as a problem that must be addressed that's a part of the culture?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, what I at least understand, could be wrong on the numbers, that 70% of India is rural, quite a large farming base, and they're facing a changing economic situation that in transition some might think could crush a rural economy and a rural society. And is that one of the problems that, although what may not have been intended to be inclusive, is that a challenging problem that might fit on that? And if so, what would you, how would that fit?
Yeah, I think certainly, for instance, water is a serious problem in India, and probably going to become an even more serious problem, and something that maybe a very top-down view of building a nation is not paying enough attention to. We're building this automobile highway system, but we're not building a water management system that can bring water to the villages, very critical for survival. So I certainly feel that the top-down management of India has not trickled down enough and will not trickle down enough, fast enough to reach the lower tiers of society where 70% of the people live. I certainly agree with that. I have my own theories, which is a whole separate set of talks on what might be an alternative Indian social model, which is not Western imported and it's not top-down either, but an Indian social model. And at some point I'd be happy to talk about it, but that's a whole separate discussion on what are some alternative paradigms. And one hint I can give you is, I do not think we can make 1 billion Americans in terms of level of consumption here. And if you take the level of per capita consumption of the Western world and try to model the third world to try and achieve that level of consumption, the raw material, the capital, all these sort of things simply don't exist. So by glamorizing a certain lifestyle which is unachievable is a bad idea. It will create conflicts. So we have to have multiple lifestyles that we consider legitimate. And we have a system called Varnashram, where different life stages, different lifestyles were considered fine. So you could be in a life stage where you don't want to consume a whole lot, and you would not be considered what Americans would call a loser. You'd be considered a fine person. You just don't like to consume a whole lot. In India, village of Gandhians would be considered bad. They would be poor because they don't consume a whole lot, and there would be problems to be fixed. I mean, that's sort of the economic model that we bought. Consumption is a measure of success, but if you can decouple consumption from what makes a person, a human being, satisfied using non-consumerism ways of being satisfied, then there may be alternative social models, and that's the sort of thinking I'm working on.
I'm Ram Prakash, I retired as professor. I have two very short questions. One is how these biases and prejudices which you have referred to affect the global economic competition in India. My second question is, did they not make any studies on subjects like corruption, judicial delays in disposal of cases, sexual harassment, etc.?
Well, the second one, I'm not, I'm sure people in India are doing this, and I hope they're doing this. The first one, how this affects competitiveness, yes. There is a certain relationship between identity, self-esteem, cultural capital, soft power, these kind of things, and actual economic performance. There's a whole lot I'm actually writing that on what is happening to Indians' cultural capital and soft power, and how it affects economic performance. I would say that even managing India's exports in manufactured goods, IT, and so on and so forth, will be related to images, perceptions, what people think of India, Indian culture, and so on. Japan did a lot to create this aura of Japanese being very meticulous, the flower arrangement, and their culture, the way these people are raised is very, very meticulous and methodical, and therefore when you buy a Sony product or anything from Japan, you expect it's very precise and high quality because we are a quality culture. So they linked their superior sense of culture to their products in the world market. French created this aura that we are great lovers, and we have therefore perfume and cosmetics and arts, and we have the Cannes Film Festival, and we are sort of, and massive French industries are based on brand value, which is that the French culture is very superior in certain things. So people would rather buy a French thing. So when you look at even the product brand value, it has to do with the value of a culture.
I have a small, very small comment that all the institutional frameworks which we have seen, that you have shown very admirably, don't you think they arise out of different desires? One is the desire to dominate. So when there is a desire to dominate, they have to create the institutional framework, like what they have done, study culture, study poverty, study conflicts, instigate conflict. And on the other hand, a country like India, where the desire to dominate in the sense to go and dominate other cultures has never been there. And if at all, whatever domination ever came, it went through monks and priests to Buddhism and to various countries. So I would say that this is actually what you say is happening. It's very frightening. But we have also to see the thing we have to protect against is the domination. All the others are the institutional framework.
Yeah, I think if you look in the deep culture, something, this in my opinion is part of a certain religious doctrine of domination, in the sense that you have been given God's franchise to go and spread a certain thing to everybody, and you'll be given points for doing that and rewarded. And this rather than an inward journey saying that you have to basically worry about your own inner being and not worry about others, it starts with that. And there's a great book called God Against the Gods that came out last year. It shows how in the 4th century, for the first time in human history, there was a marriage between a kind of religion and empire building into this monotheistic stuff. That is the origin, at the time of Emperor Constantine, that is the origin of this sort of a thing. And so its various offshoots are what we have today. You can build a model that says, there's a healthy body, healthy cells. Healthy cells don't try to conquer and invade each other, and then they start, say, cancerous tumor. And the interesting thing is the cancerous tumor is not, once it starts spreading, it's not happy with itself. It has to feed off of the rest of the body as its host. It has to keep feeding off of it and keep expanding. So, but ironically, ultimately it runs out of habitat, it runs out of healthy body. It finishes off the healthy body, and when the healthy body is dead, the cancer is also dead. Because it's not self-supporting. So an ad infinitum expansionism and growth is not sustainable. This is true. But then Wall Street, values of companies on Wall Street are premised on price earnings ratio of 30 or 40 or whatever, on the theory that earnings will keep growing. And so even if you're paying $1 today, the point is that the earnings will keep growing, so over time this will be a good investment. If Wall Street stopped growing in earnings, it was a flat world, fixed number of population, each population person consuming a fixed amount every year, hence the total GDP of the world being fixed, and hence the total income of companies being fixed, Wall Street values would have to come down by, down to 10%. There would be a collapse of the prosperity and wealth if there were no growth. But how do you grow? Either you keep growing population, but you can't do that because the planet is finite. So if the planet is finite, then you can keep growing if per capita consumption keeps increasing. So the whole system is built on growth, economic growth also. So it is a kind of a treadmill which keeps getting faster and faster, and you have to somehow keep finding new markets, new products, obsolete the old products, create new products to keep this engine of growth rate. That whole concept of civilization, I believe, is unsustainable.
I'm Ravni. I teach at Delhi University, and I actually teach Chinese studies. That's why I was very interested in that comparison that you brought up between the way China guards its own and protects its civilization, and how there's this whole China lobby in America, which we know also where the nuclear history is concerned, and how India, there is no Indian lobby. Two related questions, really. You are, like Kapilaji pointed out, the very fact that India has always, whether we call it civilization or whatever, had the space of pluralism. So your category of hunter-gatherers in India, I would like to point out slightly differently and ask you this question. India is itself a very autocritical civilization. We are the first to criticize ourselves and our shortcomings. Does that really, so if I am going to talk about sati, or I am going to talk about dowry, or I am going to talk about, the oppression of a particular minority group, does that make me a hunter-gatherer for an American dominant discourse Or does that make me an autocritical Indian? Thank you.
Very good point. I think self-criticism is the strength of our society. Self-criticism is the strength of our society. And we have to be very, very critical of all our problems and brainstorm and argue, and Indians are very good at that. I mean, Amartya Sen's latest book on the argumentative Indian is brilliant.
We extended it this afternoon.
Yeah. Yes. So my problem is when you go looking for justice in another place. You subvert the Indian courts. You consider Indian democracy to be a sham when you do that. You consider Indian media, Indian human rights groups, Indian intellectuals to be bogus. When you say, I go flying somewhere because they gave me a first class or a business class ticket and my name will be somewhere. And I have a roster of such Indians who are part of the annual parade. You can just predict every year or every other year they'll be there. They are like the Chalabis of Iraq. They are like the Chalabis. Now, the Chalabis didn't overnight get popped up. They were nurtured for the last 20 years. There's a whole stable of such Chalabis in every country. They are nurtured. They kept there. And they are wishing for the time when their services will be brought into play and they'll become multimillionaires. They get big grants and contracts. I'm problematizing the Indian who's turned into an imperialist sepoy, and not the Indian who's self-critical and working within the system and so forth. So I think there's a tiny slice of exceedingly powerful brokers between India and the West, and that's my issue.
Thank you. My name is Sushil Pandit. I'm here part of India First Foundation. In your last slide, you had two extremes. The left extreme was about people who are blinkered on, obscurantists, who see nothing wrong. And we know more or less the identity of such people. On the right extreme, you had all the red dots, and they were about people who do not even wish to see Indian state intact. Now, conceptually, I can perhaps empathize with that kind of existence, but can you specifically point out, give me identity of such groups, cultural, political, economical, social, who are these, what are these identities who are inimical to the very existence of Indian state?
Yeah, you know, in Harvard University, there's an important group that considers India as a nation to be a problem. In fact, I have a very long quote where I was attacked. I was attacked for defending India. And they said, you know, this is the partition. It was created as a result of partition. It's got bloodshed on its hands. It's an artificial state. It didn't exist. India is better off with many subnations. This theory is backed by postmodernist fashions of deconstructing nation states. This theory is exceedingly popular. You go to JNU's English department and you talk to an English professor, some of them I know, and they tell you this is postmodernist deconstruction of nation state. It is very popular. And this is brought here from places like Harvard, where you talk to somebody like Homi Bhabha in his whole theory of hybridity and so on and so forth. I mean, there is no necessity of a nation state per se. It's out of style or maybe even a radically bad idea. In fact, that to me is the most dangerous trend, and I see that becoming fashionable gradually coming into India.
So, in fact, that's more of a stratospheric intellectual realm. I'm talking about on the ground, in the country, large groups or people who profess a
No, I think the separatist groups, are a bottom-up manifestation of this very prestigious top-down intellectual theorizing. So there is this top-down theorizing of a certain kind, and it nurtures these fragments that feel they're better off separate rather than being within India. And these centrifugal forces, I'm afraid a lot of Indians don't take seriously, are not aware of them, would rather not worry about it and not deal with it. But they are there and they're accelerating.
My name is GP Bagai. You know, when you say that there are no police in the villages, I mean, one has to take the context that police is still regarded as a colonial remnant, and they're considered parasites. While in America, they are facilitators. For instance, if you cross through a red light over here, you do it because you say there's no policeman looking. While over there, they will do it because it creates an accident. Number two, when you talk about history, 1500 onwards. Well, I was raised in India, and my knowledge also is basically 1500 onwards. That's the way Indian history books are written. And lastly, it seems to me that while you're defending Hindutva,
I'm not defending
no,
Hindutva.
all right, where they went wrong was that instead of enhancing the positive, they got into the blame game, and that is why.
That's a comment.
All right. And while the Congress, on the other hand, is the new economy which is saving us. Otherwise, we would have brought India down.
Just to clear the record, I've had a huge amount of arguments and fights because I classified myself as a non-Hindutva Hindu, and I've been told both sides that there is no such thing. Those who are Hindutva saying we want to have all Hindus as included because we claim to speak for all of them, and I say heck no, you don't speak for me. And on the other side, those who want to attack Hinduism would rather attack Hindutva and by inference attack all Hindus by linking them there and push them there. So the space of the non-Hindutva Hindu, which is where I belong, is being squeezed from both sides, which I think is a tragedy. So I belong in that space, just to clear the record. Yeah.
I'm Shakti Myra, and I'm an artist. I miss to some extent, even though I was very sympathetic with the framework that you were developing, to some extent I was listening to it and trying to look at what's happening in the Indian arts. And you perhaps have chosen not to, but there are some interesting similarities in how Indian artists tend to behave in terms of accepting leadership from the West, and there are those intermediaries, the native informants, etc. So I was kind of trying to listen through that. And I would suggest that in a similar thing, it might enrich the canvas that you have to perhaps look at the
Yes.
arts as well.
Wonderful.
There was in terms of, if you look at, it's not really as bad as you're making it out to be on the ground level, because the extent of ignorance that exists in America about India, generally, school children, people on the street in New York or New Jersey, so all that this system is doing, that you described, it's not really penetrating the local population there. And in contrast, I found it quite interesting that in India, on the street, there's a lot more awareness and mistrust about America and this sort of design. So in a sense, whatever the system is trying to do, it's not really working, and that too is something worth thinking about.
My comment is that if you look in the metros, you'll see that. We went and did some work in the Tamil Nadu tsunami areas. We spent a month there in March filming, because we also have a project to bring some youth facilities to the tsunami victims. So we went around all the jatis, we lived there, we stayed overnight, we looked at all the fishermen villages and so on. I think this fragmentation with international intervention beyond this, around the state through some underbelly mysterious NGOs is on the increase. You look at some of the propaganda material that very proudly claims accomplishments, how many such people have been created, how many youth leaders there are, separatist type have been created. If you look at that kind of feeding the fragments literature, and both the intellectual discourse feeding the fragments and the funding, it is quite substantial. So you may have a sense of great confidence in the IT tier and educated English speaking tier and the metros tier. But I think if you go to Northeast, you won't find that. I mean, you go to the vulnerable places, you go to the Dalit communities, you won't necessarily find a sense of confidence and empowerment. So I'm referring to the soft underbelly of India being the vulnerable spot.
Question about the grand narrative. You have, of course, reminded us of the grand narrative, which is perhaps the basis of American power. But don't you think that the very definition you have given of Indian civilization makes the grand narrative obviously very compelling, but by definition very decentralized, very, how would I put it, atomistic. Therefore, unless you choose a sort of an imperial view of India, which some people have been criticizing for taking. You see, saying let's restore the glory of Ashoka, or Ashoka was too much of a pacifist, but Chandragupta Maurya. Otherwise, you are going to always find the problem of the extreme diversity of the Indian nation and of Hinduism, which Subhash Kak has also talked about, saying you cannot ask Hinduism to emulate or imitate or adopt the methods followed by some of the Judeo-Christian religions. Therefore, what is your answer to that? Do you think India should devise a completely different kind of discourse to project and defend?
Yes, very good point. I think the assumption has been made that a grand narrative has to be hegemonic, has to be imperialistic, has to create a monoculture. The assumption of the deconstructionists has been that every grand narrative is hegemonic, it creates a monoculture, it flattens the cultural space, it's intolerant of diversity, and therefore all grand narratives are bad. I think the people who did that did their historical research in certain European nation states which had that propensity. I don't think that I don't think an Indian grand narrative has to follow the Western example at all. I mean, there could be an Indian grand narrative which thrives on diversity, which thrives on the interdependent autonomous states. I've called it an internet kind of model. You have no center, there's nobody in control, there's movement, there's new people entering, there's some people leaving. It's a kind of a very stable equilibrium, but a very dynamic equilibrium of many decentralized nodes. I think a social model of that kind, which was very stable for India for a long time, and it also was not frozen in time because Indian science and technology progressed, certainly we can show that. That is more what I'm calling a kind of grand narrative that Indians need to think about. It's neither going back in time nor adopting a European model.
Thank you, Kablaji. Two questions. One is I have some difficulty in understanding the father-son relationship which you mentioned about, China and between China and America, and then between quote, Islamic fundamentalism and Judeo-Christian fundamentalism. Now, I wonder how the Middle Kingdom will react to your statement. Do you think the Middle Kingdom will accept the American paternity? And if paternity is not accepted by the son, can we still logically speak of it?
Well, sure.
Second, as regards the Islamic fundamentalism, terrorism, how do you find the paternity link with Judeo-Christian? Because I put it to you that a good part of the so-called Islamic terrorism can be explained as a reaction to Western policies, supported by the governments in the countries where the terrorists are. Now, I come to the second question. You said that Indian civilization has self-corrective resources. I would request you to apply that to Godhra and post-Godhra violence in Gujarat. How did the mechanism work? Thank you.
Okay. So the metaphor of father-son is not literal biological father-son. The idea being that Chinese strength and modernity is a derivative of Western technology industry. The Americans after Nixon went there and set these up, put money, put machines, trained them, brought 80,000 Chinese a year for MBAs into the United States, sent them back. So it's a father-son in the sense of derived out of Western civilization, Western modernity. Chinese may not like the word son, but I think they'll have no problem saying that, look, a huge amount of our industry is made in America. But we have taken it and made it better, and now we'll actually compete against them. That was my point. Similar analog of Islam, there is a monotheism, there is an institutionalized church concept in Islam, there is a membership concept, there is a concept of finiteness of time, there is a beginning of time, there is an end of time, and so you have very little time left because it's not infinite births and all that, it's not that kind of a thing. You have finiteness of time, and in this finiteness of time you have to carry out what you've been asked to do on this earth, and that involves a universalizing of your faith on others. So you have a clash of two opposing views each having these commonalities. So when you have two common views of such matters as finiteness of time, monotheism, one view, one book, one, and an expansion of it, you're going to have a clash. That was my point. The second question regarding how can Indian resources be applied for things like Godhra and so on. My personal belief is that this is why I'm not Hindutva, is because I feel that it was not in the spirit of Hinduism or Indian civilization to be embarking upon these projects in the first place. That's my position. I've from the very beginning not supported this idea that there ought to be a mosque demolished and another temple erected. I thought that a far better statement of our pluralism could have been made by building a different kind of a complex to show the pluralism and to document the atrocities, whatever they might have been, but without sort of saying a quid pro quo of having been destroyed is that we'll go out and destroy them. So I feel that the example you gave of Godhra is an example which, in my opinion, those things happened as a violation of the Indian ethos in the first place.
I'm Nigam Prakash, retired Ambassador of India. Some students of American culture and society feel that America could turn into a mosaic rather than continue to be dominated by the Judaic-Christian deep culture. What is your view on that? And would you think that if that happened, then their whole approach to other cultures would also change in a positive way?
This is something I've studied quite a bit. I've developed a theory called the U-turn theory. The U-turn theory says how the dominant Western culture assimilates and appropriates the other through a series of stages, 5 of them. First stage, they'll come, for instance, in the case of Hinduism or Indian thought or yoga or meditation, they'll come, be students, become a devotee, become a disciple, put on the aura, put on the identity, and so on. That's stage 1, very loyal to the tradition. Some of them will stay there, but many of them will move on to stage 2, where they'll sort of become very generic New Age and say this is universal, it's nothing to do with a particular religion or a culture or a tradition, it's something universal. I can find it in Jung, and I can find Jesus as a yogi, and I can find it on all sorts of places. So this kind of makes it neutral. And third stage in the U-turn is going back to one's native tradition and saying, I am going to be born again Christian, and I can bring all those ideas back into my own tradition. A book by Dinah Eck of Harvard, well-known scholar of Hinduism, who spent 20-30 years in her stage 1 as kind of practicing Hinduism in Banaras and so on, wrote beautifully about it. In her latest book, in the introduction, she says, my journey through this stage of all this understanding and immersion in Hinduism has now, in my senior years, made me a better Protestant. So it's a U-turn back. So I asked Sri Sri this question. Sri Sri said, I have 1 lakh people who come and listen to me. I said, yeah, but Maharishi in the 60s had 5 lakhs people listening to him. Where are those 5 lakh gone? He said, that's a good question. Where are they gone? I said, no, you find out. Where are they gone? Because wherever they're gone, your 1 lakh white devotees will be gone the same place. Where are they gone? So I said, then I told him my U-turn. I said, all the Maharishi people have U-turned back to Judaism, Christianity in their senior years. Okay, so the U-turning back into Judeo-Christianity, making it stronger than it ever was. I have a whole presentation on how U-turn, the predator becomes stronger after assimilating the prey. But for a while it looks like the predator-prey have merged into one. And there is no difference between predator and prey. They are into this very intimate intercourse, and there is no difference between them. But in the end, one eats the other and becomes stronger. So I am not sure that America's assimilation of non-Western cultures will turn it into a non-Western society, or whether it will turn into a stronger and new model, new kind of Western society. The history of Christianity is it devoured pagans. It didn't become like them. The whole Christmas tree, Easter, a whole lot of traditions were adopted from the pagans. But where are the pagans now? They're gone. They disappeared, right? So the idea of assimilating is part of expansion. And for a while it looks like there's a mosaic. It's a mosaic, it's a very kind of a murky, open space, everything goes. But ultimately, if you have an institution of power that knows how to play this power game, has been playing it for 1,000 years, it's not going to go out of business very quickly. It has a lot at stake, it has a lot of momentum, it has a lot of resources. It including has the resources of throwing postmodernism as a nice thing to make people feel like, yo, we are all kind of one. But this game of hanging on to privilege, market share, is going to intensify as the world population increases, as natural resources decrease. The competition among civilizations to hang together with the cultural capital, with the collective identity, and save themselves, their privileges at the expense of others, that competition is going to intensify. So I don't think that what you're referring to is kind of a postmodernized America. And I believe that that is not the long-term trend.
When is your book coming out? That's number one. And number two, where does ISKCON movement which started in the United States? How is it related to the pluralism that we may have?
I'm working on 3 books, but on this is expected around middle of 2006. Yeah, ISKCON, you see, ISKCON threatened Americans quite seriously. ISKCON really was a threat because a lot of people were joining ISKCON. And as in the case of Osho, I mean, it was done away with through legal intervention. Osho was disbanded, finished off. Osho was a big threat. ISKCON is a very big threat. So ISKCON is bankrupt. I don't know if you know this, but ISKCON in the United States is filed for bankruptcy because of legal problems.
However, despite that, perhaps just 2 or 3 things need, as I said yesterday and today, that we need both emptying as also capacity for careful listening. That does not mean that any analysis, as structured and sharp that it is a final word, and I hope that you will agree with me that this is far too complex and far too deep and far too multidimensional for us to come to any kind of a definitive theoretical position on both either the 2 cultures. But one segment, or if we take the analogy of a pastry, I think that one layer of that pastry you have analyzed beautifully and successfully and almost convincingly. However, there are many other levels, and those levels are levels which really make the dynamics of a culture or a civilization. The power structure that you have analyzed, and you know America better, but those of us who have been half and half, teaching and being here, I would have liked just a little presence of that minority group of the Americans who are questioning the American model, who are also in the academia. And they may not be. I know that from the days of the NDA grants to my village and all that, and one has been through all that for 40 years in the United States. But I think that cognizance, their voice is not heard at the moment, they may be powerless, but there is a voice. Yes. There is a voice, yes. And there is a very sane voice, and I think that Anantadi's whole seminar will bring that out, and in fairness, I think we need to. On the other hand, complex and India too, we cannot, this plurality is so basic in our genes, that may be cancer, but here that plurality is so much in the nature of the species of whatever is called Indian, that any essentialization of anything here negates against the very reality of this that is constantly moving and changing. And therefore, the categories in terms of Hindu or Hindutva or whatever else perhaps we need to examine those categories a little more, because there are people in this country who belong to no religion. People in this country who have never thought about it. And people in this country who are as at home in Catholic churches as they are in mosques, or they are in, many of us present here are participating in that every day. And Shakti has left, but it is in the arts then that you see that these boundaries, which are political boundaries, and we have here a very eminent structure, that when these categories are used for political purposes, that distortions begin, which is true of caste, which is true, and understanding of the Indian society in terms of, and this comes to your discipline, and that is where I, as a, wriggling jellyfish from the arts, that these, when you start analyzing, it is part of that whole exercise that in the very nature of that analytical exercise, it becomes a reductionist exercise. And that therefore, the fluidity amongst categories, and you have to devise then a new computer model to reflect that fluidity, where in India the categories change, and elsewhere one has argued that there is no such thing as a frozen category in Indian thought. Every category is reversible, and here is Arvind. Am I right on this? Tamas, Rajas, koi kuch bhi ho sakta, kabhi bhi ho sakta, inversion ho sakta, reversal. So with this, because this I say with great admiration and greater hesitation, but since you are so rare in India, I may not get another chance. Thank you very much.